Yvonne Prescott had spent 11 years on the infusion floor at Ridgeview Memorial. 100 denial letters, she said, answered with silence. Exactly one answered with a phone call to a boardroom. Just one. She didn't see anyone hire a lawyer. She didn't see a check get written. She didn't see a single raised voice. She saw one grandmother do one small thing in a hospital hallway. A thing that would, 3 weeks later, change how a health insurance company reviewed every chemotherapy request in the state of Alabama. Willa Calloway drove a 2009 Buick with 191,000 miles on it. She clipped coupons at the kitchen table with the television off. Nobody who watched her carry her own groceries into a one-story brick house on Dunbar Avenue would have guessed she'd sat through 61 shareholder calls in 9 years, or that she owned 41,200 shares of the holding company behind the very insurer now denying her granddaughter's grandfather his chemotherapy. She had bought most of those shares $400 at a time, whatever was left after the light bill. She was 68 years old, and if you had passed her in the cereal aisle at the corner grocery on a Wednesday morning, you would have had no reason on earth to look twice. In the left pocket of her gray cardigan, she carried a pair of reading glasses with blue frames. They belonged to her husband, Foster. He had been dead 9 years. She had never worn them. She had never thrown them away either. Most nights she took them out, folded them once, and set them on the nightstand, next to a side of the bed nobody had slept on in 9 years. This is the story of what happened between the third denial letter and the day those glasses got worn again. Nobody planned for it to take 9 years. It just did. Nobody warned her it would either. If they had, she is not sure it would have changed a single thing she did. This story starts in Birmingham, Alabama, in a hospital hallway that smells like every hospital hallway smells, and it starts with a number. 3. 3 denial letters, weeks apart, for a 64-year-old man who had worked 31 years on a factory floor and never once asked anybody for anything he hadn't earned first. Nobody in this story is a stranger to hard work. Not the man in the hospital bed, not his daughter working double shifts 14 miles away to keep his medication covered. Not the grandmother with the coupons and the old Buick, the shares nobody knew she owned. What happened between them is not a story about money showing up out of nowhere to fix everything. It is a story about what 9 years a pension can build, quietly, while everyone assumes you are just an old woman who likes to clip coupons on a Sunday. Foster Calloway had run a pharmacy on 6th Avenue for 33 years. Not a chain, his name on the window, his handwriting on half the labels, because he still counted pills himself on a Saturday. He married Willa in a church basement because the sanctuary was being repainted, and 41 years later, he was still telling story like it was the best thing that ever happened to him, instead of the thing he settled for. Willa and Foster had been founding members of New Canaan Missionary Baptist Church for 38 years. It was there at a Wednesday night Bible study 11 years ago that Willa first met Corrine Whitlow, a healthcare attorney who had spent 30 years fighting insurance denials for other people's families before retiring to a house 4 blocks from Willa's own. The two women were not close then. They became close 9 years ago. In the specific way, two people become close when one of them shows up at the other's door the week after a funeral with a casserole and does not leave after 15 minutes like everyone else did. 9 years ago, Foster's heart started failing in a way medicine had an answer for. The answer was a transplant evaluation. His insurance denied the evaluation twice, citing insufficient documentation of prior treatment failure. On the third submission, it was approved. 19 days after that approval, Foster was gone. The paperwork had been correct. The paperwork had just been slow enough not to matter. Willa did not sue anyone. She did not write an angry letter to a newspaper. What she did for the first 2 years was nothing anyone would have called an action at all. She sat in her kitchen on Dunbar Avenue and she read annual reports, State Insurance Commissioner complaint filings, which were public record if you knew which office to call and were patient enough to wait on the photocopies. She found Meridian Crescent Health Alliance's proxy statement in year 1 and reread it 4 times before the requirements of a shareholder proposal finally made sense to her. Not money, not a law degree, just shares held long enough and a case written the way a case is supposed to be written. She did not tell anyone what she was doing, not her sister in Mobile, not the deacons at church. She told herself at first it was just something to do with her hands in the evenings. Willa had lived in that house on Dunbar Avenue for 42 years, longer than most of her neighbors had been alive, and she still knew which of the 7 houses on her side of the street had lost someone to the same kind of quiet, slow-soothing disaster she was now trying to keep from happening to Otis. Her daughter-in-law, or her former daughter-in-law, depending on which piece of paper you asked, was named Sharice Renfroe. Sharice had married Willa's son, Damon, 9 years earlier, back when Foster was still alive, to walk her down an aisle he'd built himself out of 2 sawhorses and a length of oak. The marriage lasted 6. Damon left for a job in Houston and did not in any way that counted come back. Willa stayed. She stayed for her granddaughter, Journey, 8 years old now, and she stayed, if anyone had asked her directly, because leaving had never once occurred to her as an option worth considering. Journey was 8 years old and had 2 versions of every story she told. There was the version for her teacher, careful and complete, where she used the word grandfather and said everything was fine. And there was the version for her mother late at night, where she asked why Pop's hands shook when he held his coffee cup now, and why Grandma Willa kept coming on Tuesdays, even though it wasn't her turn. Sharice had never explicitly taught her daughter to keep those 2 versions separate. Journey had learned it the way children in that family had been learning every 3 generations, by watching which words made the adults' shoulders drop and which words didn't. Sharice worked as a certified nursing assistant at Trinity Ridge, a hospital 14 miles from the one where her own father was now a patient. She picked up every extra shift the scheduling app offered. 41 hours that week on top of her regular 32, because the anti-nausea medication her father needed cost $68 a bottle, and none of it was covered without an active chemotherapy authorization attached to his file. Her father, Otis Renfroe, had spent 31 years on the floor at Vulcan Forge Works before the knees gave out and the doctor found something worse than knees. He had started there at 19, sweeping metal shavings for a foreman who never once learned his name past Renfroe, boy, and he had retired 31 years later as a shift supervisor who trained half the younger men on that floor himself. Stage 3 colon cancer. Otis did not complain about the diagnosis. He complained once about the parking validation machine at the hospital eating his ticket. That was the extent of what he allowed himself. First in his denial letter came on Tuesday. Sharice reached an account with Journey doing homework 4 feet away, and she did the thing she was good at doing, which was not panicking where her daughter could see it. She called the insurance line. She got a case number. She learned the word peer-to-peer, which meant her father's oncologist would need to argue, doctor to doctor, with someone at the insurance company who had never examined him. That was the yes. She got the peer-to-peer scheduled. She did it herself on hold for 51 minutes, transferred twice, using every piece of medical terminology her CNA training had ever taught her, until a scheduler on the other end finally said the words she'd been chasing. Dr. Whitfield, Otis's oncologist, would speak with the insurance company's reviewing physician in 12 days. That was the but. 12 days. Colon cancer that has already spread past the wall of the colon does not wait politely for a phone call between 2 doctors who have never met. Dr. Whitfield told Sharice this plainly. The way doctors tell people things they need to actually hear instead of things that sound gentler. Every week of delay narrowed what the treatment could still accomplish. Sharice thanked him. She did not cry in his office. She cried once in her car for exactly 90 seconds with the engine off, and then she started the engine and drove to pick up Journey from the after-school program. Willa learned about the second denial on Adeltausa too, because its days were the days she came to sit with Journey while Sharice picked up her evening shift. She was in the kitchen unloading the dishwasher when Sharice came in still wearing her hospital badge, set the letter on the counter without a word, and went to check on her father's medications schedule taped to the refrigerator. Willa read the letter twice. She noticed the phrase step therapy guidelines. She had seen that exact phrase before. She did not say so. The third denial letter arrived on a Friday, which meant it would sit unanswered over a weekend, which meant 2 more days gone from a window that was already closing. Sharice called the number on the letter at 4:17 that afternoon and reached a woman who introduced herself as Diane Ostrander, Senior Director of Utilization Review. Diane's voice had the specific calm of someone reading from a script she had read so many times it no longer sounded like a script to her. The treatment does not meet medical necessity criteria under current utilization guidelines, she said. This is our third and final review at this level. Sharice asked what step therapy meant specifically for a man whose cancer had already spread. Diane explained that guidelines required documentation of a lower-cost treatment failing first. Sharice asked who wrote the guidelines. Diane said that information wasn't something she had access to from her position. Sharice noticed the way you notice a splinter you can't quite locate, that Diane never once said her father's name. Not once in the entire call. She said the member and the claim and the file, 4 times each by Sharice's count made without meaning to, the way a nurse counts a patient's breaths without being asked. Near the end of the call, Diane offered something. An expedited internal review, available if Sharice signed a form acknowledging that this decision, once issued, would be the family's final appeal at any internal level. Sharice asked to have the form read to her out loud. It was 4 sentences. The third sentence gave up the family's right to request any further internal review of any future denial, not just this one. Sharice said no. She said it once, flatly, the way she'd learned to say no to people who were hoping she was too tired to notice what she was agreeing to. Diane's voice did not change at all. She acknowledged the appeal and said the case would proceed through standard review timelines and that Sharice should expect a response within 10 business days. Standard, Sharice would learn later, also meant the file had been quietly flagged for something called high-frequency appeal review, a designation that made every future request slower, not faster, and that nobody at Meridian Crescent was under any obligation to mention out loud. That was the no, and the and came 4 minutes later. From Dr. Whitfield's office, in a voicemail Sharice listened to standing in the parking lot of Trinity Ridge in her scrubs. Her father's most recent scan showed growth, not dramatic, just enough. The oncologist wanted to move quickly. He used the words quickly and window in the same sentence. Twat. Sharice stood in that parking lot at 11:40 that night, phone against her ear, the folded third denial letter still in her scrubs pocket from 4 hours earlier. And she did not sit down on the curb, though for about 6 seconds she thought about it. She went back inside and finished her shift. There were still 4 more patients on her assignment sheet, and none of them had done anything to deserve a nursing assistant who couldn't focus. Tell me, if you've ever gotten a phone call where you already knew the answer before the person finished their sentence, what did you do with your hands while they were still talking? I think about that more than I think about anything else in this story. Not the crying, the hands. Diane Ostrander had run utilization review for 6 years. She had a denial rate posted on a dashboard she saw every morning when she logged in, a single number next to her name, next to 11 other names updated daily. She did not think of herself as a villain. She thought of herself as consistent. She applied the same guideline to every file that crossed her desk whether the name on it belonged to a stranger's father, or, though she would never have put it this way, someone's entire world. Consistency, to Diane, was the same thing as fairness. She had never once asked herself who had decided which treatments those guidelines allowed for, or why, lately, the number of things they allowed for kept getting smaller. Otis found out about the third denial 2 days later, because Sharice needed him to sign a new authorization form regardless of how the appeal went. He read it once, folded it back along its original creases, and set it on the tray table next to his water cup. He asked her one question. Had the bib from the mill union office ever called her back about his disability paperwork? He did not ask about the denial again. He had spent 31 years being told what a machine could and couldn't do for him. He was not going to spend what patience he had left being surprised by a letter. At Trinity Ridge, a fellow CNA named Sharice Loomis had worked the same floor as Sharice for 9 years, long enough to know the difference between Sharice tired and Sharice carrying something. Sandra didn't ask questions. On the Thursday after the third denial, she picked up Sharice's last 2 rounds without being asked, told the charge nurse she was covering a swap, and said exactly one thing to Sharice on her way out the door. "Go home. I've got it." Sharice didn't answer with a speech. She squeezed Sandra's shoulder once on her way to the elevator, and that was the whole conversation. That night, after Journey was asleep, Sharice sat at the kitchen table with her father's insurance policy printed out, all 31 pages of it, a yellow highlighter in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other. She had done this before for 2 other families at Trinity Ridge off the clock, because she was good at reading exactly the dot. Diane Ostrander was counting on nobody reading. Buried on page 22, she found the expedited appeals clause. If she could document urgency, the company was required to respond within 72 hours instead of 10 business days. She filed the expedited appeal herself at 1 in the morning, attaching Dr. Whitfield's voicemail transcript and the 2 most recent scans reports, typing with 2 fingers because it was faster for her than hunting for the right keys. She hit submit at 1:41. She did not know, and would not know for 11 more days, that a copy of every appeal filed against Meridian Crescent Health Alliance already sat in a spreadsheet on a laptop 9 miles away, being read line by line by a woman who used to run a pharmacy register for her husband on Saturday mornings. Willa was not on that call. But she had a copy of that third letter within 6 hours, because Sharice, exhausted past the point of pride, had photographed it and sent it to the family group text without really thinking about who was in it. Willa read it at her kitchen table at 9 that night. She set it down next to a folder she had pulled out of a closet 3 weeks earlier and had not until that moment opened. Willa opened the folder at 9:40 that night. Inside were 9 years of paper she had never let herself look at again after the funeral. Foster's transplant evaluation, the first denial, the second denial, 41 days later, the approval dated the 22nd of March, and beneath it in her own handwriting from 9 years ago, a single line. Too late, she read the second denial letter twice. Insufficient documentation of prior treatment failure under step therapy guidelines. She set it down. She picked up Otis's third denial letter, the one Sharice had photographed and sent without thinking. Insufficient documentation of prior treatment failure under step therapy guidelines. The same 6 words in the same order, 9 years and 1 insurance company apart. Not the same company, exactly. She checked twice to be sure. Meridian Crescent Health Alliance had acquired Foster's old insurer 6 years back. Same policy language. Same guideline. Different letterhead. She did not call anyone. This is worth saying plainly, because it would have been the easier thing, and Willa was tired in a way that made easier things tempting. She did not call Corrine. She did not call Sharice. She sat at her kitchen table with both letters in front of her, and she did not move for 7 minutes. Not because she was deciding whether to act. She had decided that 9 years ago, in a hospital room, watching a machine get switched off. She sat still because she was letting herself feel, one more time all the way through, exactly how long 9 years is when you spend it waiting for a reason. She thought for a moment about calling Sharice first instead of Corrine. She decided against it. Sharice had enough to carry that right night without also carrying the sound of her former mother-in-law's voice breaking. If it was going to break, and Willa was not yet certain, at 9:47 whether it was. The kitchen clock read 9:47 when she finally moved. She would remember that number for the rest of her life, the way people remember the exact time of things that only look small from the outside. Then she stood up. She walked to the small desk in the hallway where she kept her laptop, the same laptop she had used to read 400 pages of a proxy statement she had no legal obligation to understand. She opened it. She typed Meridian Crescent Health Alliance shareholder proposal portal into the search bar, though she already had the page bookmarked. She had bookmarked it 2 years ago and never once clicked submit. The company's own bylaws, buried in an appendix Willa had read so many times she could recite parts of it, allowed any shareholder who had held at least 40,000 shares or for a minimum of 1 year to submit a proposal for consideration at the annual meeting, provided it was filed no later than 11 days before the deadline printed on the investor relations calendar. Willa owned 41,200. She had held every one of them for at least 14 months. She had 11 days. She did not know yet exactly what the proposal would say. She knew what it needed to accomplish. An independent audit of the Utilization Review Department's denial patterns conducted by a party outside the company, with findings reported directly to the full board instead of filtered through the executives who oversaw the department being audited. She had read enough annual reports to know the difference between a request that gets filed in a drawer and a request built so it legally has to be answered. At 11:14 that night, she called the one person she trusted to help her write it correctly. Her picked up on the second ring, the way people do when they have spent 30 years being the person other people call at 11 at night. Willa said 4 sentences. Corrine was quiet for a moment, and then she said the only thing Willa needed to hear. "Bring the folder. I'll put the coffee on." Opening that folder had cost Willa something she did not say out loud to Corrine, not that night. For 9 years she had kept Foster's medical records in a box on the highest shelf of a closet, specifically because the shelf required a step stool, and a step stool required a decision to climb it. Reading those documents again meant reading, one more time, the exact date her husband died, measured against the exact date his approval letter was postmarked. 19 days. She had done that math before. She was going to have to say it out loud to strangers in 11 days, and there was no version of that which did not cost her something. Willa drove the 4 blocks to Corrine's house at 11:40, the folder on the passenger seat like a passenger of its own. Corrine met her at the door already dressed, robe traded for a cardigan, 2 mugs already out on the counter. She did not hug Willa or ask how she was holding up. She pulled out a chair at her kitchen table, the same table where the 2 of them had planned 2 church fundraisers and 1 funeral repast, and said, "Sit down, let's see what we've got." Corrine wanted the proposal to name Bellamy directly. Willa disagreed, twice, before Corrine talked her out of it. Naming individuals in a shareholder proposal was legally risky and rhetorically satisfying in roughly equal measure, Corrine said, and satisfying was not what this needed to be. What this needed to be was unanswerable. They kept Bellamy's name out of the written proposal itself and put it, instead, in a supporting exhibit, the compensation table straight from the company's own filing, so that any board member reading it would arrive at his name themselves, without Willa ever having to put a finger in writing. 14 miles away, at that same hour, Sharice sat in a plastic chair beside her father's hospital bed, reading Journey a chapter of a book over speakerphone, even though it was a school night and past bedtime, because some nights the ordinary things are the only things a person can still control. Otis was asleep, or close enough to it that his breathing had gone slow and even. Sharice did not know that 14 miles away, a woman she had once called Mama Cal, back when she still had a right to call her anything, was sitting at a kitchen table with 9 years of grief, a folder full of paper, deciding finally what to do with both. Neither woman slept much that night, though neither one would find out until much later that the other hadn't either. Every cause in this story has an effect somewhere else in it. That is not a coincidence. That is just what happens when two women who love the same 8-year-old girl are both awake past 11 at night, in two different kitchens, both reading the same 6 words, 14 miles apart, and neither one picks up the phone to call the other. Not yet. Corinne's first question was not about Otis, it was about the numbers. Before we write one word of this proposal, she said, I need to know exactly what we are accusing them of, in language they cannot argue with. Feelings are not evidence. Patterns are evidence. They started with the 2 letters, 9 years apart, 6 identical words. Then Corinne pulled up something she had meant to mention to Willa for weeks and never had. An industry newsletter she still subscribed to out of habit had run a short item, 3 months earlier, noting that Meridian Crescent's denial rate for oncology claims had risen 34% over the past 2 years. The newsletter had not said why. It had simply printed the number and moved on to the next item the way industry newsletters do. Willa already had the why sitting in a binder on her own bookshelf. 2 years ago, the company's proxy statement had introduced a new executive, Craig Bellamy, Vice President of Claims Cost Management, along with a new line in the compensation section. A portion of Bellamy's annual bonus, the filing explained in careful, bloodless language, was tied to reductions in what the industry calls medical loss ratio. The lower the percentage of premium dollars the company paid out in claims, the larger Bellamy's bonus. Willa had read that paragraph 2 years ago and moved past it, the way a person moves past a sentence that has not yet found a reason to matter to them. It mattered now. She laid the compensation table next to the denial rate article, next to Foster's letter, next to Otis's letter, 4 documents on one kitchen table, and Corinne looked at all 4 for a long time without saying anything. Then she said the sentence Willa would repeat to a room full of strangers 11 days later. This isn't a mistake being repeated. This is a policy doing exactly what someone built it to do. They worked until 2 in the morning. Corinne drafted the language, careful and specific, the way 30 years of practice had taught her to be careful and specific. An independent audit of utilization review denial patterns conducted by a firm with no financial relationship to Meridian Crescent Health Alliance, findings delivered directly and unfiltered to the full board no later than the next scheduled meeting. Willa signed it at 2:11 in the morning with the same pen she had used to sign Foster's death certificate, because it was the pen in the drawer, and she was not going to make more of that than it deserved. The filing required 40,000 shares, minimum. Willa had 41,200. It was not a margin that gave her any room to spare. Corinne also warned her about something less obvious than the numbers. Board meetings ran on procedure most outsiders never saw. A shareholder proposal earned exactly one thing automatically, a slot on the agenda and a set number of minutes to present it. It earned nothing else, no guarantee anyone would ask a follow-up question, no guarantee the chair would not simply thank her for her comment and move to the next item. If Willa wanted the board to actually engage instead of politely enduring her, she would need at least one member willing to ask the second question out loud, the one that kept the topic alive past the first uncomfortable silence. Corinne had one name in mind, a woman named Patrice Odom, the board's newest independent member, seated 8 months earlier specifically for her background in healthcare compliance. Corinne did not know her personally. She knew her resume, and she knew that resumes like that did not usually enjoy sitting quietly through a policy built to hide behind a denial rate. 2 days later, in a hospital room 14 miles from Willa's kitchen table, Dr. Whitfield sat down across from Otis and Sharice and used the word progression for the first time. He was not a dramatic man. He said the delay windows were narrowing the range of what treatment could still accomplish, and that every additional week without authorization made that range smaller. Otis asked him one question. Straight answer, he said. How many more weeks? Dr. Whitfield told him the truth, because Satz had asked for it and had earned, over 31 years of factory floors, the right to be given it. Sharice sat in the chair by the window and did not fall apart in front of either of them. She had learned a long time ago that falling apart was a thing you scheduled for later, alone in a car with the engine off. She asked Dr. Whitfield 2 practical questions about the appeal timeline, wrote his answers on the back of a parking validation ticket because it was the only paper in her bag, and thanked him the way you thank a person who has just told you something true and terrible and useful all at once. That night, after visiting hours ended, Sharice sat in her car in the hospital parking garage for 6 minutes before she turned the key. She did not cry. She had done her crying, 90 seconds of it 11 days earlier, and she was not in the habit of repeating herself. She sat with both hands on the wheel, not moving, doing the kind of arithmetic that has nothing to do with numbers. What she would say to Journey if the appeal failed a 4th time. What she would not say. Whether there was a version of asking Willa for help that did not feel like asking a woman who had already given up her son's marriage to now also hand over a favor Sharice had no idea how she would ever repay. She did not call Willa that night. Nobody witnessed the 6 minutes in that parking garage. That is worth saying, because most of what a person carries, they carry exactly like that. Alone, in a car, with the engine off for exactly as long as it takes, and then they turn the key and go back inside and keep going, because there is an 8-year-old at home who still needs her lunch packed for the morning. Otis's decline in those 11 days was not dramatic. It showed up in small places. He stopped finishing his coffee. He asked Sharice twice, on 2 separate mornings, whether Journey had a game that weekend, forgetting he had already asked. Dr. Whitfield called it fatigue from the disease, progressing without treatment, said it plainly without softening it, because that was the kind of doctor he was and the kind of family Otis had raised. 11 days is not a long time when you are trying to build a legally airtight case against a $2 billion company using a kitchen table, a legal pad, and a retired attorney's spare evenings. It is an even shorter time when the man the case is actually about is losing ground every single one of those days. Willa knew both of those things at once, and she did not let either one slow the other down. Willa filed the shareholder proposal on a Thursday at 10:17 in the morning, 3 days before the deadline. Then she did the thing she had been putting off for 11 days. She drove to the hospital. Sharice had been up since 4 that morning, in for a shift that started at 6 at Trinity Ridge before coming straight to see her father on her lunch break, still in scrubs, an ID badge clipped crooked to her collar. She had not planned on seeing Willa that day at all. Tuesdays were Willa's day. This was a Thursday. She found Sharice in the hallway outside Otis's room, holding 2 coffees, one of which she had bought out of habit and did not quite remember deciding to buy for someone who wasn't there yet. Willa took it anyway. They sat in the small family waiting area, the kind of room with the deltavid to the wall, playing a cooking show nobody watched. Someone had left a half-finished crossword on the side table 3 visits ago. It was still there, exactly as abandoned, the way things in hospital waiting rooms tend to stay until somebody finally throws them out. Willa did not ease into it. 11 days does not leave room for that kind of easing. "I need to tell you something I should have told you 9 years ago," she said. Or maybe just 11 days ago. I'm not sure which mistake I'm more sorry for. She set a folded copy of the shareholder proposal on the little table between them. Sharice picked it up, read the first line, and looked up without reading further, because the first line alone had already told her more than she knew what to do with. Meridian Crescent Health Alliance shareholder proposal, submitted by Dubkalawa, holder of 41,200 shares. You own stock of the company that's denying my daddy's chemo, Sharice said. It was not a question. Willa nodded once. Sharice's phone buzzed on the table before either of them said anything else. Willa answered it on speaker without asking. Kareen's voice, brisk and businesslike, filled the small waiting room. Filings in the system. Governance office confirmed receipt 11 minutes ago. It goes on the agenda for next week's board meeting. No way around it. Their own bylaws guarantee that once the threshold's met. Sharice looked at Willa the whole time Kareen talked. 11 members on that board, Willa said, once Kareen had hung up. Representing a company that covers about 700,000 people in this state. That's who's going to hear this. Not a judge. Not a lawyer with a billboard. The people who are actually supposed to be watching what this company does. It is not a request, Willa said. That's the part I need you to understand. Once we cleared the share threshold, the company's own governing documents obligate them to put this in front of the board. I am not asking Meridian Crescent for a favor. I am exercising a right their own paperwork gives me, the same as any other shareholder, the same as a pension fund or a hedge fund would use it, except I am not a fund. I am your daughter's grandmother, and I have been reading their paperwork for 9 years, so that one day I would know exactly which page to turn to. Why didn't you tell me? Sharice asked. Not angry. Sharice did not have energy left over for angry, and even if she had, it would not have been the true question underneath the one she asked out loud. Willa reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She took out the reading glasses. She had not taken them out in front of anyone since the funeral. She set them on the table next to the folded proposal, the two objects sitting side by side, blue frames and white paper. Foster, she said. That was the whole answer, sir. She did not explain it further. She did not need to. Sharice looked at the glasses for a long moment, and something in the arithmetic she had been running for 11 days quietly recalculated itself. Not the numbers changing, just what the numbers were for. Sharice did not ask why Willa had waited 9 years instead of acting the moment Otis was diagnosed. She would ask that question later, weeks from now, on a porch, in a much quieter conversation this story does not need to include in full. For now, she picked up the folded proposal, read it start to finish this time, all the way to Kareen's careful, unanswerable language on the second page, and set it back down on exactly where Willa had placed it. Otis, when Willa finally went in to see him, did not ask her a single question about the company or the shares or the board. He looked at her for a moment, the way two people look at each other when they have both buried someone and are both still doing math about it, some days, without meaning to. He said only, "You should have brought me a coffee, too." Willa told him she had one in the car, which was not true, and went to get him one anyway. If you had spent 9 years quietly building toward one fight nobody knew you were fighting, would you have told the people you love sooner? Or would you have waited until you actually had something real to put on the table? I go back and forth on that one more than I expected to. The board meeting was 6 days away. Willa spent 4 of those 6 days rehearsing with Kareen. Not the emotional parts. There were not supposed to be emotional parts, but the sequence. Which document first? What to say if a board member interrupted? How long to let a science sit before filling it? Kareen made her practice saying Bellamy's compensation figure out loud until she could say it without her voice catching on the word bonus. It took 4 tries. On the 5th, Kareen said, "That's the one, write it down exactly like that," and Willa did. Willa called her sons that same week, out of a sense of obligation more than hope. Damon listened for 90 seconds, said that sounded like a lot, and asked her to keep him posted. Then mentioned he had a meeting starting. Willa said she would. She did not call him again until after the board meeting was over. Some things, she had learned, you stop waiting on people to show up for, and you simply notice, quietly, who does. Sharice spent those same 6 days doing exactly what she had been doing for 11. Working her shifts, sitting with her father, packing Journey's lunch, because the expedited appeal she had filled herself was still, technically, working its way through a timeline no shareholder proposal could speed up on its own. Both women were fighting the same company from two completely different directions. Neither fight would have worked without the other one still holding on. The board meeting convened at 9 on a Wednesday morning. On the 11th floor of Meridian Crescent's headquarters downtown, Willa wore the navy suit she had bought for Foster's funeral, the only suit she owned that looked like it belonged in a room like that one. Corrine sat beside her, dressed to blend in with the corporate lawyers, rather than stand out from them, which had been the whole point. 11 board members sat around a long table. Diane Ostrander sat against the wall with 2 other utilization review staff present to answer procedural questions if asked. Craig Bellamy sat near the head of the table, close enough to the chair to matter. A man who had clearly expected to spend this meetings discussing quarterly numbers and not much else. The chair gave Willa exactly the 11 minutes the bylaws guaranteed her. She did not need all of it. She began with the first piece. Foster's transplant denial letter, 9 years old, laid flat on the table so the members nearest her could read the date. Insufficient documentation of prior treatment failure. 1 beat of silence, the second piece. Otis Renfroe's third denial letter, 6 words identical. A different name, a different year. The same sentence. Another beat. The third piece. The industry newsletter item, printed and highlighted, denial rate up 30, force it over 2 years for oncology claims specifically. A board member 2 seats down, a man Willa did not know, shifted in his chair, the fourth piece. The compensation table from the company's own proxy statement, Bellamy's name and title at the top. The bonus structure tied to medical loss ratio reduction laid out in the company's own bloodless language, the same language that had denied Foster and now Otis. Willa did not point at Bellamy. She did not need to. 11 heads turned toward him at roughly the same moment, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that room moved at all. Not the board members, not Diane, not Bellamy himself, who sat very still with his hands folded on the table, the way a fence sits still when he has saw that stillness is less incriminating than any expression he might otherwise make. The fifth piece Willa saved for last, an internal email obtained through the same public disclosure process that had given her everything else, in which Bellamy, 18 months earlier, had written to his department that utilization review was, in his running 12% above cost management targets, and that he expected that number closed by year end. Willa read the sentence out loud once, slowly, and then set the printed email on top of the other 4 documents, and did not say another word. For those 3 frozen seconds, the only sound in the room was the building's HVAC system cycling on. A detail Corinne would mention to Willa afterward as the strangest thing she remembered about the whole meeting. That something as ordinary as air conditioning kept running right through a stretch where, to everyone sitting at that table, the room itself seemed to have stopped. The chair asked if utilization review wanted to respond. Diane stood. Her voice did not shake. We followed every guideline correctly, she said. I stand by every decision this department made. She said it looking at the board, not at Willa. And she meant it, or had convinced herself thoroughly enough that the difference no longer mattered to her. Patrice Odom, the newest independent board member, asked the second question Corinne had been hoping for. She asked Bellamy directly whether the utilization guidelines had changed in the 18 months since his email. Bellamy said the guidelines were reviewed regularly and updated to reflect current medical standards. He did not answer whether they had gotten stricter. Patrice asked again more specifically. He did not answer that time either. The board voted to accept the proposal 7-4. Not unanimous. Willa had expected that and had told Corrine weeks earlier that unanimous would have made her suspicious of the whole process. 7-4 read like something that had actually been argued over, which was closer to true than a room full of easy agreement would have been. Willa did not smile when the vote was read aloud. She thanked the board for their time, gathered her five documents back into the folder in the same order she had presented them, and walked out with Corrine without stopping to speak to Bellamy, who did not attempt to speak to her either. In the elevator down, Corrine asked how she was holding up. Willa didn't answer until the doors opened. She said she needed to sit down somewhere that was not a boardroom. They found a diner 4 blocks away and split a plate of eggs in near total silence, which was, Corrine said later, exactly the right way to end a morning like that one. Sharice was not in that room. She was at Trinity Ridge finishing a med pass when her phone buzzed with a text from Corrine. Approved. Independent audit ordered. Findings due to the full board in 90 days. Your father's case gets reviewed under the new expedited protocol starting today. Sharice read it twice, standing at the med cart in a hallway that smells exactly like every hospital hallway smells. She did not cry. She put the phone back in her pocket, finished labeling the last cup on the cart, and went in to see her next patient, because there were still several rounds left on her shift, and none of them had done anything to deserve less than her full attention. She told Otis that evening instead, in person, sitting on the edge of his hospital bed. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he did not ask her to say thank you to anyone on his behalf. He asked her to hand him the tray table, and he wrote something on the back of a hospital menu with a pen that barely worked, folded it once, and told her to give it to Willa the next time she came by. Sharice did not open it. She did as she was told. Sharice delivered the folded menu to Willa 2 days later at the hospital exactly as her father had instructed. Willa did not open it in front of Sharice. She read it alone in her car afterward. It said 4 words in Otis's careful block handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had filled out safety inspection forms by hand for 31 years. Foster would be proud. Willa kept that folded menu in the same cardigan pocket the glasses used to live in, and from that day on she carried both. His chemotherapy was authorized 4 days later under the new expedited protocol, 23 days after the 3rd denial letter had arrived. Diane followed the guidelines. That much is true. Was that enough? Or is "I followed policy" the most dangerous sentence in a system built to decide who gets treatment and who doesn't? I would genuinely like to know what you think. Leave it below. Sunday dinners had become a fixture again by then, something that had quietly stopped happening somewhere in the 2 years after Damon left, and just as quietly started again somewhere in the 18 months after the board vote. Willa cooked. Otis showed up early enough to set the table wrong on purpose, forks on the right, just to hear Journey correct him, which she did every single Sunday, with the exact same exasperated patience an 11-year-old reserves for a grandfather she has decided is only pretending not to know better. 3 years later, on a Tuesday morning in April, Otis Renfroe walked into Ridgeview Memorial under his own power, no cane, for a follow-up scan that had become, over time, more routine than remarkable. He stopped in the same hallway where this story started, the one outside the infusion floor, and stood there a moment the way a person stands somewhere they used to dread. Yvonne Prescott, still working that floor 14 years in now, passed him with her drawing cart and looked up. She recognized him the way nurses recognize the patients who make it, which is to say completely, immediately, without needing to check a chart. She did not stop to make conversation. She gave him one nod, and he gave her one back, and that was the whole exchange, and it was enough. The independent audit Willa's proposal had triggered took 4 months to complete and confirmed most of what the 5 pieces of evidence in that boardroom had already suggested. Denial patterns for oncology and cardiac claim moms had risen sharply in the months following the introduction of Bellup's compensation structure, disproportionately affecting claims from 3 zip codes in Birmingham with lower average household incomes than the rest of the company's service area. The audit did not use the word intentional. It did not need to. The board voted, 5 months after the first meeting, to restructure executive compensation across the claims division entirely, removing denial rate and loss ratio metrics from individual bonus calculations. Craig Bellamy left the company 11 weeks after that vote. In a departure the company's press release described, without further detail, as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. Diane Ostrander still worked at Meridian Crescent, in the same department, now operating under an outside compliance monitor who reviewed a random sample of every month's denials. Nobody threw her out in disgrace. That is not usually how these things end, whatever version of this story you might have preferred. She was, several people who worked near her said, quieter than she used to be. Whether that meant anything, nobody could say for certain, including her. The outside compliance monitor's first quarterly report, made public per the new board policy, flagged 11 cases in its initial 90-day review, where a denial appeared inconsistent with the plain language of the policy itself. Diane's department reversed 9 of them without further appeal required. The other 2 went to external medical review and were reversed there as well. Nobody wrote Diane a headline for that. Nobody had written her one for the 11 months of decisions that came before it either. That absence, more than anything, was the actual shape of accountability in this story. Not a dramatic firing, a number watched quietly by somebody whose job it now was to watch it. Willa did not stay on as an active board presence longer than she had to. She had never wanted a seat on that board for its own sake. Once a permanent structural independent audit committee was seated, one that did not depend on any single grandmother owning exactly enough shares, she stepped back and let someone with actual healthcare governance credentials take the ongoing oversight role. She kept her shares. She stopped attending the calls. Corrine still came by on Wednesdays, Bible study, long since given way to something closer to a standing appointment. Neither woman called by that name anymore. They did not talk about the board much these days. Mostly, they talked about nothing in particular. The specific privilege of 2 old friends who have already said the important things to each other and can now just sit. At least 4 other families, in the first 90 days after the new protocol took effect, had a denial reversed under the expedited review process Otis's case had helped establish. Sharice knew about 2 of them by name, because Ridgeview's patient advocate office had started referring families to her directly, unofficially. Word having traveled the way, word travels in a hospital where people actually talk to each other. She had joined that office as a volunteer 8 months into her father's remission, 2 evenings a week, unpaid, due to reading from Hardia the phone and holding, and appeal writing she had once had to teach herself out of necessity at 1 in the morning. One of the families she worked with that first year was a woman named Renata Cobb, whose son's asthma medication had been denied twice, a step therapy requirement nearly identical to the one that had delayed Otis. Sharice walked her through the expedited appeal process over 2 phone calls and a Saturday morning in the hospital's community room, the same way nobody had walked her through it 3 years earlier. Renata's denial was reversed in 6 days. Sharice never told her the full story of how the expedited process had come to exist. She did not think it was her story to tell, not fully, not alone. Sharice finished her LPN certification the same spring the new plaque went up, 2 night classes a week on top of everything else, because she had noticed somewhere in the middle of all this that reading a denial letter correctly was a skill worth having a license attached to. She hung the certificate in the hallway of her apartment, not the living room, not anywhere anyone would make a fuss over it. Just the hallway, where she would see it every morning on her way out the door. Journey, at 11, had started people. Her grandfather worked at the hospital now. It was not strictly true. He volunteered 2 mornings a week. She said it anyway, chin up, the exact same way her mother had once kept 2 versions of every story straight. Except this version, finally, did not need to be kept from anyone. The plaque itself had almost not existed at all. When the compliance committee first proposed it, Willa said no. A hospital administrator, the same one who had pushed hardest internally for the new protocol, asked her to reconsider gently, arguing that some things are worth naming publicly, precisely because the person behind them would rather they weren't. Willa agreed on one condition: no unveiling ceremony, no press release, no ribbon. Someone from facilities mounted it on a Tuesday afternoon to patients, and the first person to read it was a stranger waiting for an infusion appointment who had no idea what any of the words meant. The policy the board approved did not have Willa's name on it. It had Foster's. The Foster Calloway Expedited Review Standard, printed on a small plaque mounted just inside the entrance to the infusion floor. Easy to miss if you were not looking for it, impossible to miss if you knew what you were looking at. Otis stood in front of that plaque on the morning of his 3-year scan, reading it slowly, the way a man reads something twice to make sure the first reading was right. Sharice stood next to him in scrubs on her way to her own shift 14 miles away, having stopped by first. Willa was not there that particular morning. She had a standing hair appointment on Tuesday she had kept for 30 years and had no intention of rescheduling for a plaque she had already seen. The plaque was small, 8 inches by 11, brushed steel, no photograph, just a name and 11 words explaining what the name meant. Ridgeview's facilities crew had mounted it at exactly the height where anyone waiting for the elevator to the infusion floor would see it without having to look for it. Otis touched the corner of it once, lightly. The way you touch something to confirm it is actually there, and not something you are imagining because you want it to be. At the volunteer desk down the hall, Otis signed a form to join the patient advocate office himself. Part-time, 2 mornings a week, reading other families' denial letters the way Willa had once read Foster's, except now there was a whole department built to help him do it faster. He put on a pair of reading glasses to sign the form. Blue frames. Not his prescription exactly, close enough to work, close enough that he had stopped noticing the slight blur at the edges. Willa had given them to him the week, his treatment finished, without much explanation, the way she did most things that mattered to her. He had offered to get his own prescription made up, more than once, and Willa had waved it off every time without quite explaining why. It was Sharice's, eventually, who put into words what neither of them had said out loud. The glasses were not really for seeing clearly anymore. They had already done their real work, years earlier, in a kitchen, at a table, in 7 minutes nobody witnessed. What they did now was simpler. They reminded whoever wore them, whose attention had bought the rest of this story, its second chance. The porch conversation Sharice had put off for 3 years finally happened on a Sunday evening in May, after everyone else had gone home, and it was just the 2 of them on Willa's front steps with the porch light not yet turned on. Sharice asked the question straight, the way she asked most things. Why 9 years? Why not the week Foster died, or the week Otis got diagnosed, whichever came first that actually mattered? Willa thought about it longer than Sharice expected. Because you want to burn something down immediately, she finally said, and burning something down immediately almost never actually changes anything. It just makes you feel like it did, for about a day. I needed it to actually work. That took longer than a week. It took longer than I wanted it to, some days. But it worked. Sharice did not have a response prepared for that, which was rare for her. She sat with it instead, the 2 of them quiet on the steps, the porch light still off, rough, the street going from gold to gray the way early evening does in May in Alabama, slow enough that you can watch it happen if you are not in a hurry to be anywhere else. Corrine was not there when Otis found the plaque. She had never wanted credit for any of it either, which was, Willa liked to say, probably why the two of them had gotten along so well for 11 years running. Corine's payment for 4 months of Wednesday nights and one very long night at her own kitchen table had been, as far as anyone could tell, exactly nothing beyond a standing invitation to Sunday dinner, which she took roughly every other week and always brought the cornbread. Here is the part that still surprises people when I tell them this story. Willa never once used the word forgive. Not for the company, not for Diane, not even as far as anyone knows for her own son. She did not need to. She had found something more useful to do with 9 years than carry that word around waiting to feel ready to say it. I keep thinking about those 7 minutes at Willa's kitchen table. Not the boardroom, not the vote. The 7 minutes before she opened the laptop, when no one was watching her decide who she was going to be. Most of the moments that change a family happen exactly like that, quiet, alone, recorded nowhere. You only find out about them years later if you're lucky, and usually only because somebody finally hands you the folder and says, "Here, this is what I was doing all that time. Thought I was just being an old woman who liked her coupons." That is the part the paperwork never shows. Not the audit findings, not the board minutes, not even the plaque. Just 7 minutes, a folder, and a decision nobody else got to weigh in on. Some people spend 9 years waiting for the right moment. Some people spend 9 years building one. Has someone in your life ever done something like that quietly, for years, before you ever knew? I would like to hear about it, if you are willing to share it. If this story reminded you of someone who kept up remarks long before you ever pieced together what they were actually doing, send it to them today. They probably do not hear it enough. Subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, names, and events are imagined, but the experiences they reflect are not. The exhaustion of fighting a health insurance denial while also trying to keep a job and raise a child. The particular kind of grief that turns into patience instead of anger. The quiet difference one person's persistence, held long enough, can make inside a system built to wear persistence down. Independent research into health insurance appeals has repeatedly found that a meaningful share of initial claim denials get overturned when patients or their family actually pursue an appeal. Yet most denied claims are never appealed at all, often simply because nobody had the time, the information, or the 9 years it apparently sometimes takes to learn how. The gap between Foster's story and Otis's story is not luck. It is exactly that gap. Thank you for watching.